14. God, we thank you for this morning again, for the chance to look to your word, and I pray that as we look into it, that you would give our hearts understanding, give us the knowledge of your word and how it can be applied to our life. As we look at Samson's life, even with his many imperfections, and yet we know that you used him in a mighty way to accomplish your work, we are comforted by the knowledge that it gives to us about a God who's not limited by our sinfulness or our mistakes. And as we look at Samson's life and as we understand what's going on here, as we consider this morning even an important truth about who you are and how you operate, I pray that it would challenge us and encourage us in our own Christian walk, that all we do would be done to your honor and to your glory. And so we commit this time to you. In your name we pray. Amen. On the front porch of his little country store in Illinois, Abraham Lincoln and Barry, his partner, stood. Business was all gone, and Barry asked, "How much longer can we keep this going?" Lincoln answered, "It looks as if our business has just about winked out." Then he continued, "You know, I wouldn't mind so much if I could just do what I want to do. I want to study law. I wouldn't mind so much if we could sell everything we've got, pay all our bills, and have just enough left over to buy one book, Blackstone's Commentary on English Law. But I guess I can't." A strange-looking wagon was coming up the road, and the driver angled it up close to the store porch. Then he looked at Lincoln and said, "I'm trying to move my family out west, and I'm out of money. I've got a good barrel here that I could sell for 50 cents. Abraham Lincoln's eyes went along the wagon and came to the wife, looking at him pleadingly, face thin and emaciated. Lincoln ran his hand into his pocket and took out, according to him, was his last 50 cents. He said, "I reckon I could use a good barrel." All day long, the barrel sat on that porch of that store, and Barry kept chiding Lincoln about it. Late in the evening, Lincoln walked out and looked down into the barrel, and he saw something in the bottom that he hadn't noticed before. His long arms went down to the barrel, and as he fumbled around, he hit something solid. He pulled out a book and stood petrified. It was Blackstone's Commentary on English Law. Lincoln later wrote, "I stood there holding that book and looked up toward the heavens. There came a deep impression on me that God had something for me to do, and he was showing me now that I had to get ready for it. Was this a miracle otherwise?" Martin Luther comments on this. He says, "God's wonderful works, which happen daily, are lightly esteemed, not because they're of no import, but because they happen so constantly and without interruption. Man is used to the miracle that God rules the world and upholds all creation. And because things daily run their appointed course, it seems insignificant. And no man thinks it's worth his while to meditate upon it and to regard it as God's wonderful work. And yet it is a greater wonder that Christ has fed, is it a greater wonder that God has fed 5,000 men with 5 loaves and made wine from water?" And the point is that this, from this human standpoint, right, we look at this and go, this is such a coincidence. Who would have thought? And yet, Lincoln understood that this was God ordaining and moving in his life to enable him to do what he needed to do. This morning, as we look this morning at Samson in Judges 14, I want to give you this big idea, as I think we see something that predominantly comes out of this chapter that will challenge us in our thinking. Oop, am I connected up here? Well, is Mark up there? Ben, is the my projector's, what's that? He's working on it? Okay. Well, it'll be there in a minute. And anything, you have to just use your ears, I guess, and write it down. But here's the big idea I want us to understand, is that God's divine hand governs all things to accomplish the work of his plan. As we look at Judges 14, look at Samson's story here, we're going to see a verse in particular, kind of in the early part of this chapter, that is going to be somewhat confusing for us. Is it up on my end? While they're working on that, I will slide out of the way here. But as we look at this chapter, I want us to understand that God is divining and working in our lives in everyday life. God is directing and guiding. And we're going to look at Samson's example here and what he sees happening. And we're going to see that this is a bit of a baffling moment. But maybe start here. Let's take a look at Judges chapter 14. I'm going to read the entire chapter. as we see that God is working and moving in a way that we don't begin to understand. Samson, in chapter 14, verse 1, Samson went down to Timnah. And at Timnah he saw one of the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. But his father and mother said to him, Is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives, or among our own people, that you must go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. Now his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord, for he was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came roaring toward him. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father and mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. After some days he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion, and honey. He scraped it out with his hands and went on eating as he went. He came to his father and mother and gave them some, and they ate. But he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of a lion. His father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. As soon as the people saw him, they brought him 30 companions to him. And Samson said to them, Let me now put a riddle to you. If you could tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. And they said to him, Put your riddle, that we may hear it. And he said to them, Out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. And in 3 days they could not solve the riddle. On the 4th day they said to Samson's wife, Entice your husband to tell us what the riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? And Samson's wife wept over him and said, You only hate me, you do not love me. You have put a riddle to my people, and you have not told me what it is. He said to her, Behold, I have not told my father and mother, and shall I tell you? She wept before him the 7 days that their feast lasted. On the 7th day he told her, because she pressed him so hard. Then she told the riddle to her people. And the men of the city said to him on the 7th day, before the sun went down, What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? He said to them, If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon, and struck down 30 men of the town, and took their spoil, and gave the garments of those who had told the riddle. In hot anger he went back to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. This text begins to us by talking to us about Samson's marriage to this Timnite woman. Begins with Samson's desire. With Samson's desire. In verse 1 through 3, he went down to Timnah, saw one of the daughters of the Philistines, came and told his father, and said, I saw one of the daughters of Timnah, now get her for me as my wife. But the father and his mother said to him, Is there not a woman among our own people, or among our relatives, that you have to go down to these uncircumcised Philistines? But Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. She is right in my eyes. Samson begins with this desire. He goes down. We have no idea why he went down to Timnah necessarily. It doesn't seem like he went down on a business trip of any sort, but he went there for some particular reason. And he went there perhaps looking for nothing more than a woman. We don't know exactly what is carried there, but by being down there, he saw this woman who was, in his words, right to my eyes. Now, if you remember, that phrase seems very familiar to us because in the very beginning of our study of this book, we said in those days there was no king in Israel, and the people did what? What was right in their own eyes. Now, once again, we see that theme and that phraseology coming back into this text as we apply it here to Samson. And unfortunately, what we see about Samson is he's a man driven by lust, driven by the desire of the flesh, by the desires of the eyes. He's a man, not only does he go down probably looking for a woman, but he goes down, sees the woman, comes back to his parents and says, Get her for me. Even Selena knows. Get her for me, right? disregarding any culture, any understanding of the parents' role in this, disregarding their wisdom when they say to him, isn't there someone among our own people that you can go? He says, no, she is right in my own eyes. Get her for me. In a very demanding tone. Showing a complete lack of regard for the parental authority, showing a lack of respect for them, but even more so, showing a lack of respect for God's commands. What did God tell the people when they moved into the land? Do not marry or give in marriage to the people of the lands, because by so doing you will so pollute yourself that you will become their gods will become your gods, and you will be idolatrous in my eyes. God forbade this. In fact, if you look at Exodus 34:16, is observe what I command you this day. Behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Take care lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land to which you go, lest it become a snare in your midst. You shall tear down their altars and break their pillars and cut down their Asherim, for you shall worship no other God. For the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and when they whore after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and you are invited, you eat of his sacrifice, and you take their daughters for your sons, and their daughters whore after their gods, and make your sons whore after their gods. He says, listen, don't do this. Take heed lest you do this, and you fall prey, and you become guilty of worshiping the gods of the land. And isn't that what we've already seen happening throughout this book? They have sought after the people of the gods of the people in the land that they serve, and they have already idolated themselves to the point that now, under Samson's time, they're not even crying out to God for deliverance anymore. God is interceding long before they even see it. We even see a cry from them. Looking at Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 to 3, we see the same thing. When the Lord your God brings you into land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mighty than you, and when the Lord your God gives them over to your hand and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them. You shall show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to them, and taking their sons, or giving your daughters to their sons, and taking their daughters for your sons. For they would turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But thus you shall deal with them. You shall break down their altars, and dash in pieces their pillars, and chop down their Asherim, and burn their carved images with fire. See, God strictly forbade that when they went into the land, you are not to marry with them. Because by so doing, you will become idolatrous people. They will take your hearts from me, and they will cause you to worship other gods. You shall not intermarry with them. Samson not only goes down to Timnah with whatever his objective was, he sees a woman, declares she's right in my eyes, knowing she's not of this people, not of God's own people. But then when his parents say, is there not someone among our own people? Isn't there someone here among your own clan, your own people that you could go? He says, no. She's right in my eyes. Get her for me. Disregarding not only God's commands, but his parents' advice. All of that is happening at a surface level. Then you have verse 4. Verse 4, which says this, his father and mother did not know that it was from the Lord. For the Lord was seeking an opportunity against the Philistines. At that time, the Philistines ruled over Israel. Now you've got a quandary and a conundrum here. Samson seems to be, very clearly, following the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, his own selfish passions and desires. Ignoring the commands that God has already given to the people, ignoring his parental advice, showing a complete disregard for their authority and their influence in his life, and yet, we're being told this is of God. Anybody seen the quandary yet? Is this God enticing Samson to sin, to do evil, so that he can accomplish something through it? Is God tempting Samson with sin? To answer that question, we need to go to James chapter 1, a passage which we have studied before. I want you to turn there just for a moment so you can see it in case you weren't here for that study or in case you don't remember. Because we need to see James chapter 1, verse 13, which declares to us, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death." Here's the point. James tells us very, very clearly, God is not capable of tempting you to sin. It is not in his nature. God in his nature is completely perfect. He is completely sinless. There is no inclination in him whatsoever to commit sin or to do evil. And therefore, that same God cannot entice you and I to sin. When we are enticed to sin, James makes it very clear, where does that enticement come from? Our own sinful desires. So God is obviously not tempting Samson here. God is not saying, "Samson, here's something, go do this, it's going to be fun," right? God is not enticing him to sin in any way, shape, form, or fashion. But then how do we make sense of the fact that Samson, following his fleshly desires, we're being told that this is of God? How are we to make sense of this if that's not the case? And I believe the answer falls in something we call the providence of God. The providence of God. The Heidelberg Catechism asks the question, what then is the providence of God? They answer that question with this: the providence of God is the almighty and everywhere present power of God, whereby, as it were, by his hand, he still upholds heaven and earth with all its creatures, and so governs them that herbs and grass, rain and drought, fruitful and barren years, meat and drink, health and sickness, riches and poverty, yea, all things come not by chance, but by his fatherly hand. The idea of providence is simply that it's the act of providing or sustaining or governing all things. And in other words, when you understand the providence of God, what you begin to understand, there is no such thing as luck, right? There is no such thing as coincidence. There is no such thing as chance. When you understand the providence of God, that all things are under his governing power, we understand that God is in control of all things that happen. At times, and I think we see it here in Samson's life, that even people's sinful desires and actions are still somehow under God's divine control. I think of Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love the Lord, all things work together for those who are called according to his purpose. And what I think we begin to understand is that even when we make stupid, sinful, fleshly choices, cannot God still use that to accomplish his purpose? And I think that's what we're seeing with Samson, isn't it? Samson is following his own fleshly desires. He's following the lust of the flesh. He's following those sinful impulses. I think you'll find from Samson's life, he seems to be kind of an impulsive fella. We're going to talk about the fact he's still in the Faith Hall of Fame, what that looks like. But this is this man who is following the lust of his flesh, and yet it says he is of God. That this is of God. God is not enticing Samson to evil. He is not saying, come commit this sin, come do this because it'll be fun. He is not enticing him to sin. Rather, he somehow is still guiding Samson's sinful choices so that it accomplishes his purpose. Maybe, and this is speculation because it's not in the text, but maybe Samson, rather than becoming a womanizer for his own people, God said, kind of directed his attention to the Philistines. There are other people groups still in the land, aren't there? Why did he choose a Philistine woman? Why did he go to Timnah? And I think the answer is that God's providential hand guided him that direction because God wanted to use Samson, even in his sinful choices, to bring judgment upon the Philistine people. And I believe the answer comes back down ultimately to this divine providence, the God's leading. Trent Butler, in his commentary, says it this way. We can conclude with Green, who's another commentator. The issue of the relationship between divine sovereignty, human responsibility, and punishment was either not a significant issue for the contemporary reader, or one the narrator chose to let him ponder. Exum and Weedby point out that Yahweh controls Samson's folly and ludicrous escapades. This fact allows perhaps for perplexity on the part of the reader, but not ambiguity. Not simply sexual desire was the spirit of Yahweh, but also the spirit of Yahweh drives Samson to his confrontations with the Philistines. He goes on further on to say how much of Samson's style is God ordained is not always easily determined. Certainly, as he begins to break his Nazirite vow, he is not following God's leadership. Rather, he is an insolent and independent young man, unafraid to venture into the pagan world of the Philistines and undaunted by potentially compromising situations. Still, under and through it all, God continues to provide Samson opportunities to strike blows at the Philistines. Olson avers that God is free to contravene the very laws God has given to Israel, being forbidding the intermarriage with pagan nations, for the sake of God's mercy and love for the people, and for the sake of the punishment of the oppressive Philistines. Although laws and ordered structures are important and helpful, the priority remains on God's will and God's compassion, which may at times override institutional policy, governmental regulation, and even divine law. Chisholm puts it gently. This does not mean that Yahweh overrode Samson's personality or natural inclinations, but it does suggest that Samson would not have pursued the Philistine girl apart from a divine nudge. The point is not that God came in and forced Samson to do something that he otherwise wouldn't have done, but that somehow God chose to take Samson and nudge him in that direction. Samson followed his own choices, didn't he? This is never an indication. Samson was still completely and fully responsible for the choices that he made. In the same way that you and I are always completely responsible for the choices that we made, and yet somehow God nudged Samson in the direction of the Philistines so that an opportunity could be given for God to bring punishment upon the Philistine nation. Somehow these two truths, God's divine providence, He governs and controls all things, His sovereignty, He's in control of all things, somehow that coexists with our responsibility and our personal choices. Sometimes that boggles our mind, doesn't it? Sometimes it doesn't even make sense how those two things can be true, and yet they both are. And we may not understand fully all the ins and outs of how that works, but I believe that the scriptures are clear that both are true. God divines and controls all things, guides and directs, and yet we are still responsible for the choices that we make. Samson still gives an account for those choices, but yet he was kind of under divine direction. We can't give the excuse, you heard, Satan made me do it, the devil made me do it. This doesn't give us excuse that God made me do it. We are still responsible for our own choices. You see, the reality is, what if Samson had been a man completely driven by faith? Now, I'm going to submit that I think at the very least, the final act of his life was that act of faith that puts him in Hebrews chapter 11. But if his entire life had been a life of faith where he refused to compromise, refused to walk away from his vow, refused to disobey God, refused to adulter himself, refused to stray from what God's plan was, could God have used him in the same way? The answer is absolutely yes. And the point is, it didn't happen that way, that Samson was controlled by his own fleshly impulses, and yet God, being the providential, sovereign God that He is, still was able to use it to accomplish His purpose and plan. That, for one, I think should give us comfort to know that even when we screw up, can God still work through our screw-ups for His purpose? That's a comfort, I think, to us. I think it's also a challenge to us. You know what? I want to be, in everything I do, I want to make sure my life is cooperating with God's plan, walking by faith. I don't want to have to God use me in spite of me. I want God to use me because I'm walking by faith. I think the other thing we have to note is this, that God did have a special plan for Samson's life, didn't He? Not all of us, did God come to your parents before you were born and say, hey, I got a special plan for that child of yours, and so this is what I want you to do. How many of you had that experience with your children? Anybody? Lacey's saying yes. Anybody have an angel of God come visit you and tell you, I want this to be done for your life? Probably none of us have, right? Samson was a special case for sure, but I want you to understand, it doesn't matter. We all have a purpose in our life, don't we? Isn't our purpose to glorify God, to build the church, to reach the lost, to proclaim the glory of God? We all have a purpose in our life. Samson just happened to have a little bit extra. God had a particular purpose in his life, and he was going to see it accomplished no matter what. As we go down through this text, Samson continues into a course of action that will actually cause him to violate his Nazirite vow. Look at verse 5 of chapter 14. Then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah, and they came to the vineyards of Timnah. And behold, a young lion came toward him roaring. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and although he had nothing in his hand, he tore the lion in pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she was right in Samson's eyes. After some days he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, there was a swarm of bees in the body of the lion and honey. He scraped it out to his hands and went on eating as he went, and he came to his father and mother and gave them some, and they ate, but he did not tell them that he had scraped the honey from the carcass of a lion. So here's what we see happening. His parents, despite their best efforts, could not dissuade him. She was still right in his own eyes. He still demanded that she be given to him as a wife. So they go down towards Timnah. They arrive at the vineyards of Timnah. Somewhere in this process, he is no longer with his parents. He gets separated from them because what happens next? He is separated from witnesses. He gets separated, goes off. He's in the vineyard. A lion comes charging at him. And here we're told the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon him, and nothing, with bare hands, he kills this lion and rips it apart, what the text tells us. And you wonder why is such a story told, right? Other than to make good kid stories for Sunday school, right? I don't think that was God's primary concern when he recorded it for us, but it doesn't make a good children's story, doesn't it? Well, why is this here? I think there's a couple reasons why it could be included. Number one, it could be here to introduce to us the Spirit of the Lord rushing upon him, giving him that great strength. We're going to see that several times. In fact, we see this phrase, the Spirit rushed upon him, more times than any other judge in the book. And we see it happening. We see this strength that's introduced to him, which is going to play a key factor in the final moment of his life. And so we're introduced to that a little bit. We're also introduced to the fact that he broke his Nazirite vow. Do you remember last week we looked at Numbers chapter 6? The requirements for that Nazirite vow. One of them was to avoid contact with a dead body. That was in reference to a human being, but we believe this probably still refers to any dead body, any dead corpse whatsoever. He goes, and again, was this his fault? He was defending himself, right? Was this an incurable situation? If you remember from Numbers chapter 6, there was requirements. If this happened, he had to go to the temple, had to shave his head, had to offer sacrifices, had to recommit himself and re-vow for that set period of time, and it started all over again. Now for him, it was his entire life, so it really didn't make much difference. But he still had to go through that cleansing process, right? Why doesn't Samson just do that? I believe it's because Samson had a girl in the mind. Didn't want to take the time to do that. Would have been a hassle, would have been a requirement. Which is why didn't he tell his parents? Because they would have probably encouraged him to do that, right? He doesn't tell his parents. He doesn't do this because he does not want to be inconvenienced. Again, speculation. But looking at his example in his life, it's likely the reason why he did not do this. He doesn't mention to them. So he just goes down with his parents. In fact, he makes it worse later on because then he goes back to visit the corpse. By this point, it must be completely dried out because the bees have made it a nest, and now there's honey in it. At this point, not only does he go back to a dead body, but he scoops out the honey out of the dead body. And not only does he eat it, but he also gives it to his parents, which actually defiles them by Israeli law. But they don't know it either because he didn't tell them where it came from. There's a complete disregard for Samson. Whether it's he just doesn't care, doesn't think about it, doesn't matter. He doesn't even seem to care that he has violated God's commands and violated the vows that he was given to him from birth, or that he violates the commands of God by giving them causing his parents to violate those laws. I think what we see happening is the deterioration of these judges from the time of Othniel to now. They have gotten progressively worse. Their faith is weakening. We see from here that it begins then a game of riddles. Verse 10. His father went down with a woman, and Samson prepares a feast, for so the young men used to do. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. And Samson said to them, "Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes." Which, by the way, that's probably a lot of clothing. these days, they probably didn't have a lot of sets like we might have today. That was a fair wager, a fairly hefty wager. And they said to him, okay, put your riddle that we may hear it. And he said to them, out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. Again, here's the other reason why the story of the lion is probably told to us. What is this riddle based upon? This riddle is based upon that experience with the lion, which they have no way of possibly figuring out because they don't know what happened. So Samson's probably pretty confident they are not going to figure this riddle out. But in 3 days, the text says, they could not solve the riddle. On the 4th day, they say to Samson's wife, entice your husband to tell us what this riddle is, lest we burn you and your father's house with fire. Have you invited us here to impoverish us? So not only now has he proposed this riddle, he likes a game of chance apparently. He's wagering something. He wants to get something out of this deal. So he proposes this riddle to them, doesn't tell his wife what this riddle has been. They can't figure it out. So 3 days in, they not only try to entice her to get the secret out of him, they actually threaten her and her family to kill them if they don't get it out of him. This is how desperate they are. They say, have you invited us here to impoverish us? They didn't want to lose that much. So the wife, who is apparently, her loyalties lay more with her own people than with Samson, her husband-to-be, goes to him and weeps over him. And pulls the you don't love me card. You only hate me. You don't love me. You put a riddle to my people and you haven't even told me. To which Samson says, listen, I haven't even told my parents. What makes you think I'm going to tell you? But she weeps before him, verse 17, for 7 days of the feast lasted. And on that 7th day, on the 7th day, he was like so close, right? He told her because she pressed him so hard. Then she told the riddle to her people, and the men of the city came to him on the 7th day before the sun went down, and they said, what is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion? And he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town, and took their spoil, and gave the garments of those who had told the riddle. In hot anger he went back to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So he gives this riddle. The wife batters him enough and weeps over him enough that he finally has had enough that just before the deadline, he tells her. She relays that message to her people, who then come to him and give him the answer, and he is now a man driven by anger. This text says even after the fact, he went back to his father's house in hot anger. But his anger now is what's driving his actions. He says to them, listen, if you hadn't plowed with my heifer, which doesn't sound a real complimentary thing, right? If you hadn't messed with what was mine, you wouldn't have found out the answer to my riddle. But he knows he's stuck because they still found it out, whether it was rightfully done or not. He is accusing them of cheating, but he says, I still have to follow through. So the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon him. He goes down to Ashkelon, which is another Philistine city, and he slaughters 30 men and takes their clothes. He then brings that up and pays off the debt that he owes to these ones who figured out his riddle by enticing his wife to badger him with it. Angry, after paying his debt, he goes back to his father's house, and then we're told that and this kind of sets up for the next chapter, that his wife was given to his best man, his companion who served as his best man. But it seems to indicate that maybe perhaps his marriage wasn't actually finalized yet. It wasn't consummated. It wasn't final. So they were able to take this wife and give it to another person. And we're going to find out if we look at the next chapter, it's all because they thought he couldn't stand his wife, that he hated her because he didn't come back. Assuming that because of all of this, he wanted nothing more to do with it. That's the story. Not a real high note of an end, is it? As we look into the next chapter, it gets worse. But God is using it to accomplish his purpose. Already, God has had an opportunity here. The first blow to the Philistines came because in his anger and in this trickery that he was betrayed, he went down to Ashkelon, to a Philistine city, and slew 30 men, taking their clothes. That's the first strike against the Philistines that God is using Samson to accomplish. And all the while, what's he doing? God is doing. He's using Samson's fleshly impulses, his selfish, sinful behavior, to accomplish his plan. So far, we have not seen too much in Samson that declares to him he's a man of faith. Even when we look at the final act of his life, his motivation isn't necessarily one that is righteous. Samson didn't go after the Philistines here because he was trying to deliver God's punishment to them and deliver them, the Israelites, from their oppression. What drove him was his red hot anger at the fact that he was betrayed. And yet God has used it to already begin to strike a blow to this Philistine nation. Because in God's divine providence, God's hand governs all things to accomplish the work of his plan. Even if that means using our sinful actions. Does not give us an excuse, by the way. Let me emphasize. We can never claim that God, you know what, I sinned because God told me to. Because it was for a purpose. God can accomplish his plan. He will accomplish his plan no matter what. But his hand governs all things, even our sinful choices. And he's using Samson's sinful choices to bring about a deliverance and strike a blow at the Philistines. One that begins with Samson but does not end with him, that is for sure. In this truth of God's divine providence, we find safety and security, don't we? Doesn't matter how often we screw up or how badly we mess up God's plan, he will always accomplish his purpose. It also gives us a challenge and a motivation, saying, you know what, I would much rather my life story be that I was faithful to God and God used my life of faithfulness rather than one that says I used it in spite of and I used his sinful choices to accomplish my plan. So I pray that truth, as we think about that this morning, think about God's providence, may we be a people who allow God to build faith into our life so that our faith is what drives the actions, not a life of sinfulness that God can simply use for his glory. I pray that we don't forget this, Father. And I pray that we don't forsake or wander away from the truth that we need to walk by faith. You certainly used Samson in a mighty way to strike a blow to the Philistines, but you did it in a way that, frankly, was not maybe how our minds might comprehend it. This was not a man who was predominantly driven by faith. Yeah, he's there in Hebrews chapter 11, and there was faith enough to include it there. And I believe that moment is coming. But what we see of this man so far is that he's a man driven by fleshly impulses. He's a man driven by lust, a man driven by anger, a man driven by vengeance. And yet we see your divine hand in it, guiding him and nudging him so that those actions are used against the Philistines to bring judgment upon them. And in that truth, we have the reality that you govern and control all things, that nothing, not even our sinful choices, can escape being used for your plan and your purpose. In that truth, there is such great comfort because we know that nothing can thwart your plans. But I believe also in that truth there's a great challenge that we need to be a people who walk by faith. Imagine what Samson could have done if he'd been a man who put his full faith in you his entire life. Maybe we would have seen the Philistine oppression broken long before it was. But I pray that we would be a people who are challenged to walk by faith, to recognize and put trust in the fact that your divine hand governs all things. And may we trust that truth, trust that reality, to put our faith in that. And may our every action be able to cooperate with the work of the Holy Spirit in us, that we can see your plan come to fruition. May we be a people who bring honor and glory to your name. We pray this in your name. Amen.